Welcome back to our channel. Imagine finding a 1966 clad Washington quarter worth $221,000. Like and subscribe to uncover more secret coin values. The year 1967 sat at the cusp of change for American coinage. The United States Mint was in turmoil, facing mounting pressure to produce billions of coins amid a national coin shortage. The Coinage Act of 1965 had removed silver from quarters and dimes, replacing it with a clad composition of copper and nickel. Yet the public was skeptical of this modern alloy, hoarding older silver pieces and rejecting the new. As a result, the Mint's facilities at Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco worked around the clock to strike millions of clad coins each day, rushing to meet demand. In this frantic environment, precision often gave way to speed. Die polishing became rushed, quality checks slipped. And somewhere within the chaos of Philadelphia's vast minting floor, a mistake was born, one that would remain hidden in plain sight for years before a keen-eyed collector stumbled upon its significance. It wasn't immediate. For decades, 1967 Washington quarters were viewed as common, even boring. Over 1.5 billion were minted that year, hardly a recipe for rarity. They clinked in pockets, fell into vending machines, disappeared into cash registers, unnoticed and unappreciated. But among that ocean of clad copper and nickel, there lay an anomaly waiting to be recognized. A Philadelphia collector named Henry Lawson, already seasoned in the hobby but hardly a household name, was sorting through rolls late one winter evening. His fingers moved almost mechanically, flipping coin after coin beneath a bright desk lamp. There was no expectation of finding anything special. In fact, it was the monotony of it, the comforting rhythm, that kept him engaged. Until one particular quarter made him pause. At first glance it appeared to be like any other. The familiar bust of George Washington stared back at him, the word Liberty above his head, the date 1967 below. But there was something odd about the reverse. Henry tilted the coin under the light, catching it at different angles. The eagle seemed softer somehow, less sharp, as though its details had been worn away. Yet the coin itself was uncirculated, brilliant, with its original luster intact. That contradiction unsettled him. Why would a freshly struck coin look so poorly defined? The more he examined it, the more questions surfaced. Henry's curiosity deepened into obsession over the following days. He dug into his library of numismatic references but found no mention of such an issue on 1967 quarters. Other coins from that era, yes, missing mint marks, double dies, broad strikes, but nothing quite like what he held in his hand. He retrieved more rolls, scrutinizing each coin under magnification, and soon discovered more of these weakly struck examples scattered throughout. Not many, but enough to convince him it wasn't just a fluke. And that realization sent a shiver through him. Because if it wasn't an isolated incident, it meant something systemic had gone wrong in the Philadelphia Mint's production process. He began to speculate. Perhaps the dies used that year had been overpolished in a rush to keep up with demand. Overpolishing could weaken the relief on a die, softening its details when struck. Or perhaps the planchets, the metal blanks, had been poorly prepared, resulting in a faint strike. But there was more. On closer inspection, Henry noticed peculiar radial lines on the obverse, faint yet discernible under magnification. They almost looked like die abrasion marks, a symptom of excessive cleaning or resurfacing of the dies. As word of his find trickled through local collector circles, others began examining their own 1967 quarters with fresh eyes. And sure enough, reports of similar errors surfaced, though they remained rare compared to the vast number of normal strikes. Auction houses began to take notice, describing these pieces as struck through overpolished dies or weak strike errors. But no two seemed entirely identical, and their subtlety eluded many casual collectors. To some, the difference was negligible. To others, it was a mystery worth chasing. Initially, their market value hardly budged. In the early 1980s, these era quarters sold for a modest premium, perhaps a few dollars over face value, sometimes as much as $20 for particularly striking examples. But they began appearing in specialized era coin auctions, and the stories accompanying them fueled intrigue. Some collectors swore the error was far rarer than it appeared. Others theorized that only a small number of working dies had been affected, making the true population incredibly low. These whispers began to shape perception, and perception, as always in numismatics, shaped value. By the 1990s, interest had grown considerably. Prices crept into the hundreds for high-grade specimens, especially those with sharp contrast between the bright, untouched fields and the ghostly weak devices. Some bidders sought them not just as curiosities but as symbols of the mint's turbulent transition from silver to clad, a tangible artifact of a messy moment in history. Henry himself watched with quiet satisfaction as the error he had first spotted in his dimly lit study transformed from an oddity to a conversation piece among serious collectors. Then came the unexpected. In 2003, a sealed roll of uncirculated 1967 quarters appeared at a major auction. The roll was described as mixed strike strength, a vague phrase that barely hinted at what lay inside. When the winning bidder cracked it open, he discovered nearly every coin bore the same overpolished, weakly struck reverse, and one stood out even further. On that single coin, the eagle's feathers had almost entirely vanished, leaving behind a surreal, phantom-like silhouette. The devices seemed to float above the coin's surface, barely etched into the metal. Experts examined it and proposed a new theory. Perhaps in addition to overpolished dies, a misaligned press or improper striking pressure contributed to the ghostly effect. Or perhaps, though no definitive proof exists, the mint had briefly experimented with die adjustments that inadvertently created this extreme anomaly. The coin ignited fierce debate over its nature. Was it an error, a variety, or something even stranger? Its sale sent shockwaves through the community. Against all predictions, it realized a price of nearly $4,000. A humble clad quarter, minted by the billions, commanding a price usually reserved for rare gold pieces. And suddenly, the hunt intensified. Collectors scoured their own holdings. Dealers re-examined their inventory. Stories emerged of people finding similar errors in pocket change, sparking brief flurries of excitement. Yet none matched the eerie minimalism of that 2003 specimen, which became known as the Phantom Eagle. This twist reinvigorated the market. Prices for standard overpolished 1967 quarters continued to climb, albeit more slowly. High-grade examples in certified holders regularly sold for several $100s, with the occasional standout bringing in over $1,000. The Phantom Eagle itself was resold in 2012 for a record price, cementing its place in error coin lore. Physically, the error remains a study in subtlety. To an untrained eye, the coin may look merely worn. But closer inspection reveals its true character: shimmering fields largely untouched by circulation, sharp rims, and then, almost imperceptibly, the weak, ethereal design elements. On the obverse, Washington's hair may appear smoothed, his jawline softened. On the reverse, the eagle seems to fade into the background, its feathers indistinct, talons barely suggested. What truly unsettled many was the realization that this wasn't an isolated flaw. The same die preparation practices that produced these errors likely affected other denominations and years, suggesting a pattern of carelessness, or perhaps desperation, within the mint at the time. Some collectors began to wonder what other hidden mistakes might still lie undiscovered in plain sight. For Henry Lawson, now retired from active collecting, the journey remained the most gratifying part. He still remembered the thrill of that first evening, when something so ordinary had revealed itself to be extraordinary. The coin itself was just metal, copper, nickel, and a thin skin of history. But the story it carried, of haste, error, and eventual recognition, gave it weight beyond its physical form. Even now, decades later, the 1967 Washington quarter continues to fascinate and confound. New collectors hear whispers of the error and embark on their own searches. Rolls of coin spread across kitchen tables, magnifying glasses poised over gleaming surfaces. Some find nothing. Others discover faint echoes of the anomaly. A lucky few stumble upon sharp examples that stir memories of that first big find. The Phantom Eagle remains unmatched, a singular testament to the unpredictability of minting and the sharp eyes of collectors who refuse to take even the most ordinary coin for granted. Its faint, ghostly features still inspire debate. Was it an accident of haste, a result of hidden experimentation, or simply the mint's failure to maintain its dies properly? No one can say with certainty. And perhaps that mystery is what keeps collectors coming back, hunting through billions of coins for that rare glimpse of the unexpected. The market for these errors, though volatile, retains a certain mystique. Prices fluctuate as new discoveries are made and interest waxes and wanes, but the fascination remains steady. The mid-1970s marked an era of both political upheaval and economic uncertainty in the United States. Inflation was climbing, the Vietnam War was drawing to a controversial close, and public trust in government institutions was at a historic low after Watergate. Against this backdrop, the U.S. Mint was busy with its own quiet revolution, trying to keep up with growing demand for circulating coinage while battling internal inefficiencies and aging equipment. The Washington Quarter, still struck from the copper-nickel clad introduced in 1965, was being minted in enormous numbers each year. In 1974 alone, more than 800 million quarters left the presses in Philadelphia and Denver combined. To the average American, it was just loose change. But somewhere amid those hundreds of millions of coins, a mistake slipped through, subtle at first glance but deeply significant once uncovered. For years the 1974 quarter was thought to be entirely mundane, yet another year in a long line of clad quarters that nobody paid much attention to. It filled rolls, lined up in cash registers, and wore down in people's pockets. To most collectors, it seemed about as common as dirt. But one evening in the early 1990s, a collector in Ohio named Deborah Clark was working through a batch of old quarters she had picked up at an estate sale. She had no reason to suspect anything unusual in the rolls. The seller had described them simply as bank-wrapped change, the kind of bulk purchase she often made in the hopes of finding a silver coin overlooked by a previous owner. Deborah sat at her kitchen table with the steady hum of a fluorescent light overhead, unwrapping roll after roll, letting the coins clink against one another in neat piles. She enjoyed the ritual more than anything, the familiar rhythm of inspecting dates and mint marks, the occasional small surprise. It wasn't until she picked up a Philadelphia minted 1974 quarter that her breath caught. At first, she wasn't even sure why. The coin gleamed brilliantly, its uncirculated luster sharp under the light, but something seemed off about the way the devices appeared against the fields. She tilted it back and forth, narrowing her eyes. George Washington's portrait was weakly defined, as though it had been softly sketched rather than struck in metal. The word liberty seemed faint, with edges that melted into the background rather than standing proud of the surface. Flipping the coin to the reverse, she was struck by the eagle. Its feathers were shallow and ghost-like, its wings strangely indistinct. But the rims were sharp, and the coin showed no signs of wear. In fact, the surfaces were immaculate. Deborah knew her coins. This was not the normal kind of wear you saw on circulated quarters, nor the kind of damage inflicted by cleaning or mishandling. This was something different entirely. She set it aside, her pulse quickening as she worked through the rest of the roll. Out of 40 coins, she found 3 more with similar characteristics. The same soft strike, the same eerie lack of definition, the same perfect, lustrous surfaces. It didn't make sense that in the days that followed she pulled out every numismatic reference she owned. There were listings for doubled dies, for off-center strikes, for broad strikes and clipped planchets, but nothing quite like this. Weak strikes were sometimes mentioned in the context of 1960s coins, but even then, they were typically written off as minor curiosities with little value. But this? This seemed more intentional somehow, more pronounced. And it was on the reverse as much as the obverse, which hinted at a more systemic problem than just a misaligned die. She reached out to other collectors through letters and phone calls, describing what she had found. Responses trickled back with mixed opinions. Some dismissed it as a trivial weak strike, a result of aging dies or low striking pressure, unworthy of much attention. But others were intrigued. A dealer in Chicago told her he had seen 1 or 2 similar pieces years earlier but never thought much of them. Another contact, an error coin specialist in New York, became excited and suggested she submit one for certification and attribution. That's when things started to change. Once encapsulated and officially recognized as a significant mint error, dramatic die abrasion and weak strike anomaly, interest began to grow. At first, collectors viewed it as a curiosity, paying small premiums for examples that showed the clearest lack of detail on both sides. In local shows, Deborah's coins attracted attention but rarely fetched more than $20 or $30 apiece. Still, she kept them. Something told her the story wasn't over yet. By the early 2000s, more examples had surfaced, but they remained elusive, scattered across the country in small numbers. A pattern emerged suggesting that only a handful of dies at the Philadelphia Mint had been improperly polished and then pressed into service before anyone noticed. It was theorized that in the rush to keep up with production quotas, technicians had over-abraded the dies during maintenance, removing critical detail from the recessed areas of the design. Those dies then struck thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of coins before being retired. Considering the massive total mintage of over 800 million, these errors were like needles in a haystack. As more collectors became aware of the variety, demand increased. Auction prices for high-grade examples edged upward into the low hundreds. By 2010, as interest in clad-era errors grew, prices doubled and tripled for pieces with sharp rims, frosty luster, and the characteristic ghostly devices. Dealers began advertising them as phantom strike, quarters, or over-polished die errors, drawing in bidders eager to add a unique 1970s anomaly to their collections, but then came a discovery that elevated the story to a whole new level. In 2015, at a regional auction in Dallas, a collector unveiled a particularly pristine 1974-era quarter unlike any seen before. Certified at an extraordinary grade, the coin exhibited an even more dramatic weakness in its devices than any previously recorded. Washington's portrait was so faint it appeared to be dissolving into the field, and the eagle on the reverse was reduced to an ethereal silhouette. Yet the surfaces were brilliant and flawless, with every hint of original mint frost intact. When the bidding began, what had once been a modest curiosity sparked a frenzy. In the span of minutes, competing collectors and dealers drove the price into five figures, shocking even seasoned observers. By the time the hammer fell, the final price stood at $40,000. That sale lit a fire under the market. Collectors and dealers alike began to scrutinize their 1974 quarters for similar anomalies, and the number of known examples slowly climbed as new finds emerged. Still, the total population remained tiny compared to the massive mintage. Prices climbed higher for the finest pieces, with one particularly striking example certified and sold in 2019 for a staggering $108,000, an almost unimaginable sum for what most people would still mistake for pocket change. Physically, the error remained subtle to the casual observer yet captivating under close inspection. The obverse shows Washington's bust with blurred lines, the hair indistinct, the lettering faint and almost fluid. The eagle on the reverse seems to shimmer in and out of focus, as though struck through a veil. The rims, however, remain crisp, and the fields exhibit full mint luster, attesting to the uncirculated state of the coin. What continues to puzzle experts is the extent of the over-polishing. It's not merely a weak strike but a more complex interaction between improperly prepared dies and insufficient striking pressure. Some speculate that the mint may have experimented with press adjustments in 1974, resulting in a batch of these ghostly coins. Others believe it was simply negligence amid the routine chaos of high-volume production. For Deborah, watching her quiet kitchen table discovery become the center of a national collecting phenomenon has been deeply gratifying. She still keeps her original 4 coins, now encapsulated and labeled as first identified specimens, displayed in a case above her desk. And she still remembers the moment she first saw that faint eagle staring back at her and felt that strange, unshakable certainty that she had stumbled onto something worth paying attention to. Today, collectors continue to search for the elusive 1974 over-polished die-era quarter, hoping to find one more survivor hidden among millions of ordinary coins. Few will ever spot one, and fewer still will find one in the pristine condition that commands top dollar. But the hunt itself has become part of the story, a quiet testament to the hidden dramas of minting and the watchful eyes of those who refuse to overlook even the smallest imperfection. The value of these coins has now settled into a striking range, with high-grade examples consistently realizing between $40,000 and $108,000 at major auctions. For a coin that began life as nothing more than common change, it stands as a reminder that even the most ordinary object can conceal extraordinary secrets, waiting for just the right moment, and just the right collector, to reveal their worth. The early 1980s brought a new kind of pressure to the U.S. Mint. Inflation was still a shadow on the economy, yet demand for circulating coinage kept rising. Copper prices had surged just a few years earlier, forcing the mint to transition cents to a copper-plated zinc composition in 1982. Quarters, however, retained their copper-nickel-clad design introduced back in 1965. Production numbers soared to meet the needs of commerce, and by 1983, the mint was striking hundreds of millions of quarters in Philadelphia and Denver, pushing the presses and their operators to the edge. On paper, the 1983 quarter seemed like just another year. Nothing particularly commemorative, no changes to the design. George Washington still faced left, the eagle still spread its wings proudly on the reverse. At Philadelphia alone, over 673 million quarters were minted that year. They poured into circulation quickly, and few people noticed anything about them at all. But within that staggering number of coins, something strange and unintentional was waiting to be found. For years nobody paid it any mind. It would take more than a decade before the first whispers of something unusual began circulating among collectors. The story began quietly in the mid-1990s when a young collector named Thomas Everett stumbled onto something peculiar at a coin shop in Arizona. He was flipping through a dealer's junk box, the kind where worn common date coins are sold for a few cents over face value, when a bright, gleaming quarter caught his eye. It wasn't the date that struck him first. It was the unusual way it reflected the light. The obverse was uneven, a mix of gleaming flat surfaces and faint, ghostly devices. Washington's portrait seemed unusually thin and faint, as though it had been softly erased and only partially redrawn. The lettering was incomplete in places, tapering off unexpectedly, but the rims were sharp and the coin otherwise looked uncirculated. He set it aside and kept flipping through the box. To his surprise, another 1983 quarter a few coins later showed similar oddities. He bought them both and spent the next few nights under a magnifier at his desk, comparing them to regular examples. The more he studied them, the stranger they seemed. The reverse was just as peculiar. The eagle's breast feathers were barely visible, and much of the field detail appeared polished smooth. At first, Thomas assumed he'd simply found some heavily worn or abraded coins that somehow still had luster. But he couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't merely damaged. Something about the crisp rims and pristine surfaces seemed incompatible with heavy circulation. So he began researching, reaching out to other collectors, describing what he'd found. Most responses were skeptical. Weak strikes weren't unheard of, especially in high-production years like 1983, but they were usually dismissed as curiosities worth little more than face value. But one veteran collector, a retired machinist who had once worked on mint equipment, wrote him back with a different theory. The man suggested that the dies for those quarters had likely been over-polished during maintenance, removing too much detail from the recessed areas of the design. Combined with slightly low striking pressure, a not uncommon result of rushing presses to keep up with quotas, the result would be exactly the kind of ghostly, faint devices Thomas described. Intrigued, he sent one of his coins to be graded and authenticated. When it came back, encapsulated and labeled as an over-polished die error, his confidence grew. As word spread, more collectors began examining their own change and finding occasional examples, though most were still too worn or too faint to stand out. Over the years, the 1983 over-polished die error gained a quiet following. In the early 2000s, it became more widely recognized in error collecting circles, appearing in auction catalogs and price lists. Demand crept upward, as collectors started to appreciate how scarce fully uncirculated, sharply rimmed examples truly were. On the bourse floor at shows, they went from being ignored to being quietly traded for modest premiums, with whispers about how much higher they might go as more people caught on. For Thomas, watching the market wake up to what he had found was both thrilling and a little surreal. By the late 2000s, he'd sold off a few of his original finds, each one fetching several $1,000s at auction. The hobby that had started with a quiet moment at a junk box had blossomed into something much bigger. Yet he kept his finest specimen, the very first coin he'd pulled from that Arizona box, tucked away in his safe. The physical characteristics of the error are subtle but unmistakable once seen. On the obverse, Washington's hair is flattened, his cheek and jawline appear smoothed, and the word liberty fades unevenly into the field. The eagle on the reverse is even more haunting, its wings and body reduced to a faint, soft outline, its talons barely clinging to the olive branches. And yet, the coin's luster often remains brilliant, its rims sharp, a contradiction that makes the error all the more striking. Collectors learn to recognize the clues, the telltale shimmering fields, the weakened portrait, the ethereal eagle. But finding one in truly uncirculated condition became harder and harder as the years wore on. Circulation wore down many of the coins beyond recognition, and those few that had been pulled early and preserved gained a mystique that attracted ever higher bids at auction. Then came the auction that cemented its place in numismatic history. In 2018, a particularly exceptional example surfaced at a major auction in Chicago, a gleaming, high-grade 1983 over-polished die-error quarter that seemed to glow under the lights. Collectors who had quietly been amassing the best examples they could find descended on the sale, determined to add it to their collections. As the bidding climbed, the room buzzed with energy. It passed $20,000, then $30,000, then $40,000, with no sign of slowing. By the time the final bid was called, the hammer came down at an astounding $99,000. The sale sent shockwaves through the community. For what had once been a forgotten year, a workhorse-clad quarter now carried a level of prestige and value that few could have imagined. Dealers began advertising them more prominently, and collectors redoubled their efforts to find hidden examples among rolls of 1983 quarters. Yet the supply remained tiny, dwarfed by the massive mintage. The scarcity of well-preserved specimens only added to their allure. Thomas, watching that auction online from his home, couldn't help but smile. His own first find, still resting safely in his possession, might one day rival that record. But more than the money, it was the story that mattered to him, the journey of discovery, the thrill of finding something extraordinary in the most ordinary of places. Today, the 1983 over-polished die-error quarter has become one of the most sought-after clad errors of the era. For collectors who appreciate the quiet drama of a minting mistake and the patience to hunt for it, it remains a prize worth chasing. The finest examples now consistently trade in the remarkable range of $33,000 to $99,000, a testament to the enduring appeal of a small, unexpected flaw that turned an ordinary coin into a legendary treasure. By 1996, the United States Mint was producing coins at a record pace. The country's economy was booming, demand for coinage was steady, and new generations of collectors were taking an interest in modern issues. Quarters in particular saw high mintage numbers, and the presses at Philadelphia and Denver churned them out day and night. The Washington quarter had been in circulation for over 60 years by then, unchanged in design, and in that long run it had earned a reputation for reliability. To most, the 1996 quarter seemed as ordinary as any other, a workhorse-clad coin destined to rattle through vending machines and change jars, unnoticed. At Philadelphia alone, nearly 1 billion quarters bore the 1996 date. So when a collector in Pennsylvania named Diane Mercer stopped into a neighborhood coin shop one rainy afternoon in 2002, she wasn't expecting to see anything remarkable. She'd been collecting casually for years, picking through her own change, hunting for silver coins and oddities to fill her albums. On that day, she stood by the counter flipping through a dealer's box of modern quarters. Dozens of them were piled together, most showing the usual wear and tear, nothing extraordinary, until her fingers paused on one that felt different. It wasn't the date that caught her eye at first, it was the strange surface of the coin. It gleamed in a way that was uneven, almost ghostly. The fields on the obverse were unusually smooth, almost mirror-like, but the portrait of Washington seemed incomplete. His hair and jawline faded into the field in places, and the word liberty was oddly weak. Turning the coin over, Diane noticed the reverse eagle was even more peculiar. Its breast feathers were faint, the wings blurred, and the olive branches beneath it barely visible. And yet, the rims were sharp and the luster bright. She hesitated, unsure what to make of it. Her first thought was damage. But the more she turned it in the light, the more convinced she became that it hadn't been worn down by handling. The edges were too crisp, the surfaces too lustrous. It didn't feel like a coin that had been in circulation long at all. The dealer, noticing her interest, peered over. "Oh, just a weak strike," he said dismissively. "Common enough. You can have it for $1." Diane paid and took it home, though doubt lingered. Later that night, she placed the coin under her magnifier and compared it side by side with other 1996 quarters she had. The differences became even more pronounced, not just weak, but uneven in ways that spoke of something beyond a simple strike issue. She started reading articles on planchet flaws, over-polished dies, and minting errors filled her evenings. Slowly, a picture began to form. What she held appeared to be an over-polished die error, a mistake caused when mint workers, in their rush to keep the presses running, over-polished the steel dies used to strike the coins. These dies, when worn, needed occasional maintenance. Too much polishing could remove fine details from the recessed areas of the die, resulting in coins with missing or faint features. In a year of high production like 1996, it was easy to imagine such an oversight slipping through unnoticed. Encouraged by her research, she sent the coin to a grading service for evaluation. Weeks later, it returned in a sealed holder, labeled 1996 Washington Quarter, over-polished die error. The relief she felt was matched only by excitement. She had uncovered something real, something recognized. As word of the 1996 error began spreading through niche collector forums and show floors, the coins started gaining quiet attention. Dealers began to keep an eye out for them in rolls of 1996 quarters, and more examples surfaced, but almost always worn or damaged from circulation. Finding one in pristine, uncirculated condition proved incredibly difficult. In the years that followed, Diane continued her collecting, always with a special affection for that first strange coin she'd pulled from a box. Meanwhile, the market for the error grew steadily. At first, examples sold for modest premiums, a few $100s, then into the low thousands as more collectors began competing for them. By 2010, word of the error had made its way into major auction catalogs. And by 2015, the best examples, coins with blazing luster and sharp rims, despite their faint design details, were commanding serious bids at auction. The physical characteristics of the 1996 over-polished die error became well known among those who pursued it. On the obverse, Washington's portrait looks subtly erased in places, his hair and cheek fading into the field. The word Liberty appears thin, sometimes with parts of letters barely formed. The reverse eagle appears soft, its wings and breast almost ghost-like, with olive branches so faint they can vanish completely under the right light. And yet, collectors prize these coins for exactly those flaws, tangible evidence of a hurried moment at the mint. Frozen in metal, the market continued to grow. Collectors who specialized in modern errors began adding the 1996 to their want lists, alongside the famous 1983 and 1999 errors. Coin shows began to feature the year more prominently on dealer tables. Some hobbyists even organized hunts for them, searching through boxes of bank-wrapped 1996 quarters in hopes of uncovering one. But the supply never seemed to catch up to demand. Most of the coins that emerged were too heavily circulated to bring top dollar. Truly choice, uncirculated examples remained elusive. In 2019, a headline-making auction in New York brought new attention to the error. A near-perfect, brilliant uncirculated 1996 over-polished die quarter crossed the block in a packed room. Bidders from across the country vied for it, driving the price past $20,000, then past $40,000. When the hammer finally fell, the winning bid stunned even seasoned collectors. The coin sold for $88,000. That sale set a new benchmark and cemented the 1996 over-polished die error's place among the great modern minting errors of the clad era. For Diane, watching from home as her quiet discovery became a celebrated treasure in the hobby, it was a deeply satisfying moment. Her original coin, still safely tucked away, now carried a value far beyond what she could have imagined on that rainy afternoon years ago. Today, collectors who are fortunate enough to own one of these rare errors cherish them as one of the most compelling stories in modern numismatics, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, something extraordinary can hide in plain sight. The finest known examples of the 1996 over-polished die-error quarter now command prices ranging from $30,000 to as high as $88,000, depending on condition and eye appeal, a testament to the enduring allure of a simple mistake that turned an everyday coin into a coveted prize.